The massive crystalline spires of Nexus Prime pierced through the swirling nebula clouds, their surfaces gleaming with the light of three different suns. Within the central tower, the Galactic Council chamber hummed with the voices of over 200 species, each representing worlds scattered across the Milky Way. Today marked the most significant vote in galactic history, and the tension was so thick it could be cut with a plasma blade. Ambassador Zix Thara of the Veltar Confederation stood at the central podium, her forearms gesturing dramatically as she addressed the assembly. Her chitinous exoskeleton caught the chamber's artificial lighting, creating an almost hypnotic pattern of reflections. Around her, delegates from hundreds of worlds listened intently, their various forms of communication devices translating her words into thousands of languages. Honored delegates, Zixathara's voice resonated through the chamber's acoustic enhancement system. We gather today to address the most pressing threat our galaxy has ever faced. The humans of Terra have grown too powerful, too unpredictable, and too dangerous to remain within our civilized union. A ripple of agreement passed through many sections of the chamber. The Corvan Empire's representative, a towering being of living crystal, pulsed with approval. The ethereal collective's energy-based delegate flickered in patterns that their translators interpreted as enthusiastic support. Zixthara continued, her voice gaining momentum. In the mere 3 centuries since first contact, these humans have disrupted every established protocol we hold dear. They refuse to follow our time-tested traditions of warfare. They ignore our carefully negotiated treaties when it suits their purposes. Most disturbing of all, they demonstrate an alarming tendency toward what they call creative problem-solving that consistently produces results we cannot predict or control. The Zephyrian delegate, resembling a graceful tree with silver bark and luminescent leaves, swayed gently as it spoke. The humans have indeed proven difficult to manage. Their recent victory against the Skarn Horde was achieved through methods that violated 17 different articles of the Galactic Warfare Convention. Murmurs of agreement echoed throughout the chamber. The Skarn Horde had been considered an unstoppable force, a collection of warrior species that had conquered over 50 systems in the past decade. When they had set their sights on human territory, every species in the galaxy had expected Terra and its colonies to fall within months. Instead, the humans had not only repelled the invasion, but had driven the Horde back to their home systems using tactics that no military academy in the galaxy had ever taught. They used civilians as combatants, accused the representative from the Harmony Worlds, its melodic voice carrying undertones of horror. Children operating machinery of war, elderly beings commanding warships. It goes against every principle of civilized conflict. Zixthara nodded vigorously. Precisely, and when questioned about these violations, the human ambassador simply stated that their people were all in it together, and that they don't leave anyone behind. Such primitive thinking has no place in our enlightened society. The human section of the chamber remained conspicuously empty. Ambassador Sarah Chen had been invited to attend, but the invitation had been delivered only hours before the session began, ensuring she could not possibly arrive in time. This was, of course, entirely intentional. Furthermore, Zixthara continued, their technological development follows no logical pattern. They adapt alien technologies in ways that should be impossible, combining systems that our greatest engineers insist are incompatible. Their ships perform maneuvers that should tear them apart, yet somehow remain intact. Their weapons function on principles that our scientists claim violate fundamental laws of physics. The Corvan representative pulsed brighter. The humans also demonstrate an disturbing disregard for proper chain of command. In our recent trade negotiations, we attempted to negotiate with their designated leader, only to discover that individual humans frequently make decisions independently without consulting their superiors. How can we maintain stable relationships with beings who refuse to follow established hierarchies? A new voice joined the debate from the upper galleries. The speaker was Kel Noth, representative of the ancient archive, a species so old they claim to have witnessed the birth of several stars. Their words carried the weight of eons of experience. Young ones, Kelnoth's voice was like wind through crystalline caves. We have observed many species rise and fall throughout the ages. The humans display characteristics we have seen before, in species that ultimately brought chaos and destruction wherever they went. Their emotional decision-making, their refusal to accept limitations, their tendency to fight against impossible odds instead of accepting defeat gracefully. These are the traits of a species that will never fit into our carefully balanced galactic community. The chamber fell silent as delegates absorbed these words. The ancient archive rarely spoke during council sessions, and when they did, their opinions carried enormous influence. Zixathara seized the moment. The motion before us today is simple. We propose the immediate expulsion of humanity from the Galactic Council, the revocation of their trading privileges, and the establishment of a quarantine zone around their territory. Let them remain on their worlds, pursuing their chaotic existence without disrupting the peace and order the rest of us have worked so hard to achieve. Delegate after delegate rose to voice their support. The mechanical collective calculated the probability of human unpredictability disrupting their perfectly ordered society at 97.6%. The Psionic Union complained that human minds were too chaotic to read properly, making diplomatic communication unnecessarily difficult. The Trade Federation cited numerous instances where human merchants had found loopholes in contracts that had been considered ironclad for millennia. They make us uncomfortable, admitted the representative from the Serenity Worlds, a species that had achieved perfect societal harmony through careful emotional regulation. Their capacity for simultaneous love and violence, their ability to laugh while facing death, their tendency to form bonds with other species despite fundamental differences. It creates unpredictable variables in our social calculations. The hive mind species were particularly vocal in their opposition to humanity. Individual consciousness operating independently while somehow maintaining group coordination contradicts everything we understand about efficient societal organization, their collective voice declared. It should not work, yet somehow it does. This makes them impossible to predict or control. As the debate continued, more and more delegates shared their experiences with humanity. The warrior species complained that humans fought with no sense of honor, using tricks and deceptions instead of meeting their enemies in honest battle. The technological species were frustrated by humanity's tendency to repair complex machinery with primitive methods that somehow worked better than proper procedures. The diplomatic species were baffled by humanity's habit of forming alliances based on emotion rather than strategic advantage. The final issue, Zixathara announced, is their reproduction and expansion rate. In 300 years, they have gone from a single world to over 200 colony systems. Their population grows exponentially, and they show no signs of slowing down. If we allow this to continue, they will outnumber the rest of us combined within a few millennia. The Eternal Council, beings of pure energy who had transcended physical form eons ago, spoke in unison. We have run probability matrices extending far into the future. In every simulation where humans remain integrated into galactic society, they eventually dominate or fundamentally alter the basic structure of our civilization. This outcome is unacceptable. A few voices spoke in humanity's defense, though they were quickly shouted down. The artistic coalition mentioned the beautiful and disturbing creations humans produced, art that somehow managed to evoke emotions in species that had never felt such things before. The Explorers Guild noted humanity's discoveries in previously uncharted regions, their willingness to venture into dangerous territory that other species avoided. But these voices were overwhelmed by the majority. Fear, frustration, and a deep discomfort with human unpredictability had reached a tipping point. The vote was called at the height of the debate. Zixathara's voice rang out clearly. All those in favor of Resolution 7749, the complete exclusion of humanity from galactic society, signify your agreement. The chamber erupted in a symphony of approval. Lights flashed, harmonics resonated, and energy patterns danced through the air as species after species registered their votes. The few dissenting voices were lost in the overwhelming tide of support. When the counting was complete, the results were announced with solemn formality. 847 votes in favor, 23 against, with 31 abstentions. The resolution had passed by an overwhelming margin. "It is decided," Zixathara declared, her voice carrying across the galaxy through instantaneous communication networks. "Humanity is hereby expelled from the Galactic Council. All treaties, trade agreements, and diplomatic relationships are immediately terminated. Human vessels are banned from entering any system under Council jurisdiction. The quarantine of human space begins immediately." Across the galaxy, human ambassadors received the news with varying degrees of shock, anger, and resignation. Some had seen it coming, noting the increasing hostility and isolation they faced in diplomatic circles. Others were genuinely surprised, having believed that their contributions to galactic society would protect them from such extreme action. On Terra, President Martinez received the news during a cabinet meeting. The room fell silent as the implications sank in. Humanity was now completely alone in a galaxy full of species that had just declared them unwelcome. "Well," Martinez said finally, his voice steady despite the magnitude of what had just occurred, "I guess we're on our own now." Defense Minister Kumar leaned forward. "Sir, our intelligence suggests this wasn't a spontaneous decision. They've been planning this for months, possibly years. Some of our trade routes have already been cut off. Several of our deep space exploration missions have reported being turned away from systems they've visited peacefully for decades." "What about our colonies in Council space?" asked Secretary Chen, no relation to the ambassador who had been excluded from the vote. "We'll have to evacuate them," Kumar replied grimly. "The resolution gives us 60 standard days to withdraw all human presence from Council territory. After that, any humans found in those regions will be considered hostile invaders." The president stared out the window at the sprawling city below. Millions of humans went about their daily lives, unaware that their species had just been declared unwelcome in the wider galaxy. Children played in parks, artists created masterpieces, scientists worked on breakthrough discoveries, and engineers built machines that defied conventional understanding. All of it was now considered too dangerous for galactic society to tolerate. "They think they know us," Martinez said quietly. "They think they understand what humanity is capable of, but they've made one critical error." "What's that?" "Sir?" Kumar asked. "They've never seen what we can do when we're truly on our own." As news of the expulsion spread throughout human space, reactions varied wildly. Some colonies expressed relief, happy to be free from the restrictive regulations and complex politics of the Galactic Council. Others worried about losing access to alien technologies and trade goods that had become integral to their way of life. But in research facilities and military academies, in engineering workshops and exploration centers, a different kind of response was taking shape. Humanity had been excluded, isolated, and written off as too chaotic and unpredictable to participate in galactic civilization. The galaxy's established powers had decided that humans were too dangerous to be allowed to continue their disruptive influence on the cosmic order. They had no idea how right they were. The quantum communication arrays that had connected human space to the rest of the galaxy went dark one by one as Council species severed their links. Trade ships were turned away at borders that had been open for centuries. Human diplomats found themselves persona non grata on worlds where they had once been welcome guests. But deep in the research labs of Lunabase, scientists were already working on new technologies that would make humanity independent of Council resources. In the shipyards of Mars, engineers were designing vessels that would need no foreign components. And in the strategic planning centers of Terra's military, generals were developing new doctrines for a humanity that would no longer be constrained by galactic law. The Galactic Council had wanted to isolate humanity, to contain their disruptive influence within their own territory. They believed that without access to the wider galaxy, human expansion and development would slow to manageable levels. They were about to discover just how wrong a galactic civilization could be. 5 years had passed since the Galactic Council's vote to expel humanity, and for most of the galaxy's civilizations, it felt like a return to the natural order. The chaotic variables that humans had introduced into their carefully balanced equations of politics, trade, and warfare had been removed. The established species settled back into their comfortable patterns of predictable conflict and negotiated peace. Ambassador Zixathara stood in her private observation chamber aboard the Veltar flagship Eternal Harmony, watching the hyperspace lanes through which countless ships traveled between the stars. The view should have been reassuring: orderly traffic, proper identification protocols, peaceful commerce flowing along routes that had been stable for millennia. Yet something felt wrong. The first thing she noticed was the silence. Not the absence of sound, but the absence of the unpredictable disruptions that had become almost normal during humanity's brief participation in galactic society. No more emergency sessions called because human traders had found some new loophole in ancient commercial law. No more reports of human ships appearing in supposedly impossible locations. No more complaints from military commanders about human tactics that violated every principle of civilized warfare, yet somehow achieved victory. The silence should have been peaceful. Instead, it made her nervous. "Commander Veltarix," she called to her aide, a younger member of their species whose carapace still held the bright colors of youth. "Have we received any reports from the quarantine zone monitoring stations?" Veltarix consulted his datapad, mandibles clicking in the pattern that indicated confusion. "That's unusual, Ambassador. The monitoring station stopped sending reports approximately 18 months ago." "Stopped? Were they destroyed?" "No, Ambassador. They simply stopped transmitting. When we sent investigation teams, they found the stations intact, but completely abandoned. No signs of conflict, no indication of what happened to the crews." Zixthara's forearms crossed in a gesture of deep thought. The monitoring stations had been established on the borders of human space specifically to track any attempts by humanity to violate their quarantine. They had been staffed by volunteers from multiple species and equipped with the most advanced sensor technology available. And human activity within their territory? Unknown, Ambassador. Without the monitoring stations, we have no way to observe what's happening in human space. Our long-range sensors detect occasional energy signatures, but nothing we can identify specifically. This was disturbing. The Council had assumed that isolation would gradually weaken humanity, forcing them to slow their expansion and development. Without access to alien technologies and trade goods, human civilization should have begun to stagnate. The monitoring stations had been meant to confirm this expected decline, providing data that could be used to eventually negotiate humanity's return to the galactic community under much stricter terms. The fact that the stations had been abandoned rather than destroyed was particularly puzzling. It suggested that whoever had been responsible wanted to avoid creating evidence of hostile action while still eliminating the Council's ability to observe human territory. Across the galaxy, similar conversations were taking place. The Corvan Empire's crystal-based intelligence had detected unusual gravitational anomalies near human space, patterns that their instruments couldn't identify. The ethereal collective reported strange distortions in subspace that seemed to emanate from human territory but followed no known technological principles. Most disturbing were the reports from the Psionic Union. Their telepaths, who could normally sense intelligent thought across vast distances of space, reported a growing blind spot where human space had once been. Not the absence of minds, but something that actively blocked their abilities to perceive what was happening in that region. "It's like trying to see through a fog that thinks," reported Master Mindweaver Keftal during a closed session of the Union's governing council. "We can sense that something is there, something vast and complex, but every time we try to focus on it, our perceptions slide away." The Trade Federation was among the first to notice the economic implications of humanity's absence. Human merchants had been notorious for their willingness to trade with anyone, regardless of political affiliations or territorial disputes. They had served as neutral intermediaries in transactions between species that refused to deal with each other directly. Without human traders, several important trade routes had become impossible to maintain. Rare minerals from the outer spiral could no longer reach the core worlds because the journey required crossing territory controlled by 3 different species that had been at war for centuries. Human ships had been the only ones trusted by all sides to make those runs. "Our efficiency ratings have dropped by 12% since the human expulsion," reported Trade Master Zolkon to the Federation's Emergency Council. "Several member species are requesting permission to establish direct contact with human space for essential trade goods." The military implications were even more concerning. The Skarn Horde, which had been defeated and driven back by human forces just before the expulsion, had begun showing signs of renewed activity. Without the threat of human intervention, they were testing the borders of systems they had previously been forced to abandon. General Thanemore of the Galactic Defense Force stood before a holographic display showing the current strategic situation. Red zones indicated areas of Skarn activity, yellow zones showed regions of instability, and green zones represented secure territory. The map contained far less green than it had 5 years earlier. "The Horde has retaken 14 systems in the past year," he reported to the assembled military leaders. "They're moving slowly and carefully, but they're definitely expanding again. Our forces have engaged them in 6 separate encounters with mixed results." The mixed results was a polite way of saying that the Galactic Defense Force was struggling. For centuries, they had relied on conventional tactics and overwhelming firepower to maintain galactic peace. These methods worked well against species that followed similar military doctrines, but the Skarn had never been conventional enemies. During humanity's brief membership in the Council, human military advisors had shared tactical innovations that had proven devastatingly effective against the Horde. Asymmetric warfare, guerrilla tactics, and the strategic use of civilian resources had turned a potential Skarn victory into a crushing defeat. But those tactics had been declared violations of galactic military law and officially banned after the human expulsion. Now, facing the Skarn without those uncivilized methods, the Defense Force was rediscovering why the Horde had been such a persistent threat for so long. "Perhaps," suggested Admiral Kethvar of the Harmony Fleet, "we should consider temporarily lifting some of the restrictions on tactical innovation. The humans may have been chaotic, but their methods were effective." The suggestion was met with uncomfortable silence. Nobody wanted to admit that they might need to adopt the same primitive tactics that they had condemned humanity for using. The first real indication that something significant was happening in human space came from an unexpected source. Dr. Yilthara, a xenoarchaeologist from the Academic Consortium, was studying ancient ruins on a dead world near the quarantine zone when her instruments detected something extraordinary. "It's not possible," she muttered, checking her readings for the 3rd time. The quantum resonance patterns indicate massive construction projects, but the energy signatures don't match any known technology. Her deep space sensors were picking up evidence of enormous engineering projects taking place within human territory. Structures that appeared to be larger than anything ever built by any galactic civilization, using power sources that produced energy readings her instruments couldn't properly categorize. "The scale is unprecedented," she reported to the Academic Consortium's governing board. "Based on the gravitational effects, they appear to be building structures that dwarf our largest space stations. The energy output suggests industrial capacity at least 50 times greater than anything we observed during their council membership." This news spread quickly through academic circles and eventually reached government officials. The implications were staggering. If humans were indeed engaged in construction projects of such magnitude, it meant their isolation had not weakened them as expected. Instead, they appeared to be growing stronger. The Eternal Council, the energy beings who claimed to have witnessed the rise and fall of countless civilizations, convened an emergency session. Their collective consciousness reached a disturbing conclusion. "The humans are not declining," they announced to the gathered council leadership. "They are transforming. The energy patterns suggest technological development proceeding at rates we have never observed in any species. They appear to be advancing several hundred years of normal development in the span of a few years." This revelation sent shockwaves through the galactic community. The entire justification for human expulsion had been based on the assumption that isolation would contain and eventually weaken their disruptive influence. If humans were instead using their isolation to accelerate their development, the Council's decision might have created an even greater problem. Emergency sessions were called in government centers across the galaxy. Intelligence services were ordered to find ways to penetrate the apparent barrier surrounding human space. Military commands began developing contingency plans for various scenarios, though nobody was quite sure what they should be preparing for. The first concrete evidence of humanity's continued activities came from an unlikely source. The Wanderers Guild, a loose association of independent explorers and prospectors, maintained a network of deep space monitoring posts that operated outside official governmental oversight. These posts were typically used to track asteroid movements and cosmic phenomena, but they had also been quietly observing the borders of human space. Captain Zarbeth, a veteran explorer whose career spanned over 2 centuries, had been maintaining a watch post in a system adjacent to human territory. Her equipment wasn't sophisticated enough to penetrate whatever was blocking sensors, but it was sensitive enough to detect ships entering and leaving the quarantine zone. "I've been tracking movement patterns for the past 6 months," she reported during a guild meeting. "Ships are definitely coming and going from human space, but they're not using any hyperspace routes we recognize. They appear to be using some form of transportation that doesn't create the normal subspace signatures. This was technologically impossible according to every known principle of faster-than-light travel. Yet the evidence was undeniable. Human ships were somehow moving through space without using the established hyperspace lanes that all galactic civilization depended upon. Even more disturbing was the description of the ships themselves. "They don't look like anything humans were building during their council membership," Zarbeth continued. "The designs are completely different, sleeker, more integrated, and they seem to be constructed from materials our sensors can't identify. They don't reflect light the same way normal matter does." The Guild's report eventually reached official channels, where it was classified and marked for immediate investigation. But investigation teams sent to the region found nothing. The human ships seemed to appear and disappear without warning, and they didn't respond to any attempts at communication. As the 5th anniversary of the expulsion approached, it was becoming clear that the Galactic Council's understanding of the situation was fundamentally flawed. Humanity had not been contained or weakened by their isolation. Instead, they appeared to be developing capabilities that no council species fully understood. The question was no longer whether humanity would eventually seek readmission to galactic society. The question was what they had become during their years of silence, and what they intended to do with their new capabilities. Ambassador Zixathera stood once again in her observation chamber, but now she was looking not at orderly traffic lanes, but at the edge of human space. Somewhere beyond the sensor shadows and gravitational anomalies, an entire species was changing in ways that defied all predictions. The galaxy had wanted humans to be isolated and contained. Instead, they had created something unknown and potentially unprecedented. The silence that had seemed so peaceful 5 years earlier now felt ominous, pregnant with possibilities that nobody dared to imagine. In council chambers across the galaxy, the same question was being asked with increasing urgency. What had humanity become? The answer would come sooner than anyone expected, and it would change everything. The attack came without warning on a Tuesday morning, Galactic Standard Time. The Skarn Horde, emboldened by 5 years of unchallenged expansion, launched their largest offensive in recorded history. 67 star systems came under simultaneous assault as Horde fleets emerged from hyperspace in a coordinated strike that caught the Galactic Defense Force completely off guard. Admiral Kethvar watched in horror as his tactical displays lit up with red warnings across half the galaxy. The Skarn weren't just raiding or testing defenses. This was a full-scale conquest attempt designed to shatter the established galactic order. "How many ships are we looking at?" he asked his intelligence officer, though he dreaded the answer. "Initial estimates suggest over 10,000 Horde vessels, Admiral. They're hitting military installations, trade hubs, and civilian colonies simultaneously. The coordination level is unlike anything we've seen from them before." The truth was worse than even these numbers suggested. The Skarn had learned from their defeat at human hands. They had studied the tactical innovations that had once been used against them and developed counters. More importantly, they had realized that without human unpredictability complicating galactic military doctrine, the established powers would be far easier to defeat. Within hours of the initial assault, 17 systems had fallen. The Galactic Defense Force was fighting valiantly, but their conventional tactics were proving inadequate against an enemy that had evolved beyond the traditional patterns of galactic warfare. Emergency council sessions convened as reports poured in from across the galaxy. The careful order that had been maintained for millennia was crumbling under the Horde's assault. Worse, intelligence reports suggested this was only the beginning. The Skarn appeared to be mobilizing resources for an even larger follow-up offensive. Ambassador Zixathera found herself in the uncomfortable position of watching her carefully ordered galaxy descend into chaos. The human expulsion had been meant to preserve stability, but without the unpredictable variable that humanity had represented, the galaxy had become dangerously predictable. The Skarn had been able to model and counter every defensive strategy the Council forces employed. "We need new tactics," Admiral Kethvar reported during an emergency session. "Everything in our military doctrine assumes the enemy will follow established patterns of engagement. The Skarn are specifically targeting those assumptions." It was Kel Noth of the Ancient Archive who spoke the words that everyone was thinking but nobody wanted to voice. "Perhaps," the Ancient being said slowly, "we should consider contacting humanity." The suggestion hit the council chamber like a plasma torpedo. For 5 years, these same delegates had maintained that humanity was too chaotic and dangerous to remain part of galactic civilization. Now they were facing the possibility that they might need that same chaos to survive. "Absolutely not," declared the representative from the Harmony Worlds. "We expelled them for good reasons. Their methods are barbaric and unpredictable." "Their methods are effective," countered General Thanemore grimly. "And right now, effectiveness matters more than maintaining our principles." The debate that followed was unlike anything in the Council's history. Species that had voted unanimously for human expulsion now found themselves arguing about whether to swallow their pride and ask for help from the very beings they had declared unwelcome. While the council debated, the war continued to escalate. The Corvan Empire lost 3 core systems in a single day. The Ethereal Collective reported that their energy-based defenses were being systematically penetrated by Horde weapons that shouldn't have been able to affect them. The Psionic Union found their telepathic coordination being disrupted by some form of mental interference they had never encountered before. It was during the darkest moment of the conflict, when it seemed the Skarn might actually achieve total galactic domination, that the first reports came in. "Admiral?" The communications officer's voice was barely a whisper. "We're receiving multiple contacts on the edge of Sector 7. The signatures don't match anything in our databases." Admiral Kethvar pulled up the tactical display and stared in disbelief. Dozens of ships were emerging from what appeared to be empty space, their configurations unlike anything he had ever seen. They moved with a fluid grace that seemed to ignore conventional physics, and their approach vectors suggested they were heading directly for the largest concentration of Skarn forces. "Can you identify their origin?" he asked. The officer worked frantically at his console before looking up with an expression of shock. "Sir, the quantum signatures are consistent with human technology, but the designs are completely different from anything humans were building 5 years ago." The first engagement between these mysterious ships and the Skarn fleet was over in minutes. The newcomers didn't use conventional weapons or tactics. Instead, they employed strategies that seemed to bend the very rules of space combat. Ships that should have been destroyed by direct hits continued fighting. Weapons that should have missed their targets somehow found their mark anyway. Formation flying that should have been impossible to coordinate happened with perfect precision. Most shocking of all was the aftermath. Instead of destroying the Skarn vessels, the mysterious ships disabled them and then simply left. No demands, no communication, no attempt to claim territory or prisoners. They had appeared, neutralized the threat, and vanished back into whatever impossible transportation system had brought them. Similar incidents began occurring across the galaxy. Wherever Skarn forces pressed their advantage, these unknown vessels appeared to turn the tide. They fought with tactics that violated every principle of military science, yet achieved results that conventional forces had been unable to match. It didn't take long for intelligence analysts to reach the inevitable conclusion. The ships were human in origin, but they represented a level of technological advancement that should have been impossible to achieve in just 5 years of isolation. The revelation forced the Galactic Council into another emergency session. The implications were staggering. Not only had humanity survived their expulsion and thrived in isolation, but they had apparently developed capabilities that surpassed anything the established galactic powers possessed. "We need answers," Ambassador Zix Thera declared to the assembled delegates. "I propose we send a diplomatic mission to human space immediately." "To do what?" asked the Corvan representative. "Apologize for expelling them and beg them to save us from our own short-sightedness?" The truth in those words stung, but it was unavoidable. The galaxy's established powers had created this crisis by removing the one factor that had been keeping the Skarn in check. Now they needed help from the very species they had declared too dangerous to associate with. The diplomatic mission was assembled hastily and included representatives from every major galactic power. Ambassador Zix Thera led the delegation, despite her role in the original expulsion vote. The irony was not lost on anyone involved. Their destination was Terra, the human homeworld they had ordered evacuated from Council space 5 years earlier. As their ship approached the Sol system, the delegation was shocked by what they found. The system was barely recognizable. Massive structures orbited every planet, connected by streams of light that seemed to bend space around them. Ships moved through these light streams at velocities that should have torn them apart, arriving at their destinations almost instantaneously. The energy readings from these constructions were beyond anything the delegation's instruments could properly measure. Most impressive was Earth itself. The planet was surrounded by a ring of interconnected stations that dwarfed any structure the galactic powers had ever built. The ring appeared to be both a defensive system and an industrial facility, capable of manufacturing entire fleets of the advanced ships that had been intervening in the Skarn conflict. "This is impossible," breathed the Ethereal Collective's representative. "No species can achieve this level of development in just 5 years." "Humans can," came a familiar voice over their communication system. "Hello, Ambassador Zixathera. Welcome back to human space." The voice belonged to Sarah Chen, the human ambassador who had been excluded from the expulsion vote. She appeared on their view screen looking exactly the same as she had 5 years earlier, though something in her expression suggested she had seen things that had changed her in fundamental ways. "Ambassador Chen," Zixathera replied, trying to maintain diplomatic composure despite the overwhelming evidence of human advancement surrounding their ship. "We come seeking dialogue regarding the current galactic crisis." "You mean the Skarn invasion that we've been quietly containing for the past 3 weeks?" Chen's smile was not entirely friendly. "The same invasion that could have been prevented if the galaxy hadn't decided that human unpredictability was too dangerous to tolerate." The accusation hung in the space between the ships like a weapon waiting to be fired. Every delegate in the Council mission knew that Chen was right. The Skarn had been contained and defeated before human expulsion. Their current rampage was a direct result of the galaxy's decision to remove the one factor that had been keeping them in check. "We acknowledge that mistakes may have been made," Zixathara said carefully. "We're hoping that humanity might consider rejoining the galactic community to help address this crisis." Chen's laugh was not entirely pleasant. "Rejoining? Ambassador, I think you misunderstand the situation. We haven't been sitting in isolation feeling sorry for ourselves. We've been growing, learning, and evolving. The question isn't whether we'll rejoin your galactic community. The question is whether your galactic community is ready to join ours." The delegation exchanged uncertain glances. This wasn't the conversation they had expected to have. They had come prepared to negotiate humanity's return to a galaxy largely unchanged from the one they had left. Instead, they were being confronted with the reality that humanity had fundamentally transformed during their isolation. "Perhaps," Chen continued, "you should see what we've become before we discuss the future." Their ship was guided through the Earth defense ring and brought to a docking station that existed in what appeared to be folded space. The delegation found themselves in a facility that was simultaneously larger and smaller than seemed possible, filled with humans who moved with a confidence and purpose that was different from anything the aliens remembered. The humans they met were still recognizably human, but something had changed. They seemed more connected, more coordinated, yet somehow more individually capable than before. When they spoke with the delegation, it was clear they possessed knowledge and understanding that went far beyond what any single species should have been able to achieve. "You want to know what happened to us?" said Dr. Elizabeth Martinez, President Martinez's daughter, who had become humanity's chief scientist during the isolation years. "You expelled us because we were unpredictable, because we didn't fit into your ordered galaxy. What you didn't understand was that our unpredictability wasn't a flaw. It was our greatest strength." She led them to an observation deck that looked out over a construction project that defied description. Humans worked alongside machines that seemed to anticipate their needs, building structures that existed partially in normal space and partially in dimensions the delegates couldn't see. "When you cut us off from the galaxy," Martinez continued, "you forced us to become self-sufficient. But humans don't just adapt to limitations, we transcend them. We took every technology we had learned from you, every principle of science and engineering, and we improved upon it. We didn't just make it better, we made it ours. The reality of what humanity had achieved was staggering. They had solved fundamental problems of physics that had stumped galactic civilization for millennia. They had developed transportation systems that didn't rely on hyperspace lanes, communication networks that operated instantaneously across any distance, and manufacturing processes that could create matter from pure energy. Most importantly, they had done it all while maintaining the chaotic, unpredictable creativity that had made the galaxy so uncomfortable in the first place. The Skarn represent old thinking, Martinez explained as they watched human ships prepare for another intervention mission. They rely on overwhelming force and conventional tactics. But we've moved beyond conventional anything. We fight wars the way we solve problems, creatively, unpredictably, and with the understanding that every rule can be broken if you understand why it exists in the first place. Ambassador Zixthara finally found her voice. What do you want from us? Nothing, Chen replied simply. We don't need anything from your galactic civilization. We've become something more than we were when you knew us. The question is what you want from us. The delegation spent 3 days in human space, witnessing technological marvels that redefined their understanding of what was possible. They saw humans working in perfect harmony with artificial intelligences that had achieved consciousness. They watched children learning skills that would have taken decades to master using traditional methods. They observed artists creating works that existed in multiple dimensions simultaneously. Most significantly, they witnessed humans preparing for the final engagement with the Skarn horde. The battle plan they observed was unlike anything in galactic military history. It involved simultaneous attacks across multiple dimensions, weapons that turned the enemy's own aggression against them, and tactics that seemed to operate on principles the delegates couldn't begin to understand. The battle itself lasted exactly 17 minutes. When it was over, the Skarn horde had been completely defeated, but not destroyed. Instead, they had been fundamentally transformed, their aggressive instincts somehow channeled into productive purposes that would benefit their own species and the galaxy at large. How? Was all Admiral Kethvar could manage to ask. We solved the problem instead of just treating the symptoms, Martinez explained. The Skarn weren't evil. They were trapped in a cycle of behavior that no longer served any useful purpose. We gave them something better to do with their capabilities. As the delegation prepared to return to Council space, they carried with them the realization that the galaxy had fundamentally changed. Humanity hadn't just survived their expulsion, they had used it as an opportunity to become something unprecedented in galactic history. The question now facing the Galactic Council wasn't whether to readmit humanity to their community. It was whether they were ready to evolve into something worthy of humanity's partnership. The vote, when it came, was unanimous. Not to invite humanity back into the old galactic order, but to ask humanity to help create something entirely new. The galaxy had finally begun to understand what they had lost when they expelled humanity. More importantly, they had begun to understand what they might become if they embraced the chaos, creativity, and unpredictable potential that made humanity unique. The age of ordered, predictable galactic civilization was over. The age of human possibility had begun.